Hey traders, welcome back to the FXC YouTube channel. Last week was a tougher week for me. Started off great, but the latter half of the week I realized I wasn't seeing the charts nearly as clear as I normally would. And after some reflection, I came to the conclusion that I was on the lower time frames much more frequently than I normally would. And because of that, I was building my biases based on the price action I was seeing on the lower time frames, rather than what the hourly time frame was showing me. This was a learning experience for me, and hopefully it doesn't happen again. But anyways, we did have some interesting price action last week. So let's go over the recent price action and then try to come up with some trading ideas for next week. But first, hit the thumbs up button and subscribe if you haven't already. Now let's get into it. Okay, let's start with the fundamentals. So it's somewhat of a quiet week next week. We don't really have so much. On Tuesday during the PM session, we have FOMC meeting minutes. And then on Wednesday, we have unemployment claims. And then on Thursday during the London session, we have all kinds of PMI data coming out for the Euro region. But if you look right below that, it's also a bank holiday in the US. So this is the start of the Thanksgiving holiday weekend. And what I'm thinking right now is if this PMI data moves the market, we may just see continuation throughout the day because the US isn't working. And then on Friday, we have PMI data coming out for the US, but I don't expect so much movement in the markets on Friday when this data comes out, mainly because it is Thanksgiving holiday weekend and the financial institutions are more than likely going to be working with skeleton teams. Okay, now moving on to the charts, starting with the yields. So you can see that they're starting to push down lower now. And if they do continue to the downside, as I mentioned during last weekend's video, the area that I'm interested most is the sell side liquidity below. It's consistent in all three charts, and as you can see, we have fair value gap just below it. So it's a logical area for price to continue down to, and an area that we may see a reaction if it does continue that low. The only thing that bothers me right now is the fact that fundamentals are suggesting a weaker dollar. So we may see a much bigger pullback on the yields than I'm anticipating. So it may just get to this level and continue even lower. Let's have a quick look at the majors. So what you can see is EU appears to have the most strength out of all of them. It's already starting to take out the highs, the previous highs, whereas the others are struggling to break the previous highs. But one thing you will notice is that AU and NU has already swept all the buy side liquidity. GU on the other hand is lagging the furthest behind because the buy side liquidity is way the hell up here. So it's got a long ways to go if it's going to go for it. But if we do see a reversal in the near future after this buy side liquidity is taken, it doesn't look like GU is going to get to the buy side liquidity. Okay, moving on to DXY now. So I'm going to start with the monthly time frame. So what you can see is DXY has gone through the monthly fair value gap now. It's also come into the monthly order block and it's getting close to reaching the discount levels. But on this time frame, aside from the order block, there isn't really any clear areas of interest on this time frame. Okay, on the weekly time frame, you can see that DXY has gone through the monthly fair value gap now. It's also gone through this tiny little weekly fair value gap as well. And we have discount levels just below that. So the most logical areas for DXY to target now is obviously the discount level, but we also have sell side liquidity right here, which coincides with the weekly order block. So this would be the next area of interest that I will be looking at if and when DXY reaches that point to see if we get a reaction or potential reversals. But keep in mind there is a weekly fair value gap below that as well, and our OTE levels are going to be down in this area. Now on to the daily time frame. So you can see that early last week we had that nice drive to the downside coming into the daily fair value gap, and then we reacted off of it, coming back into the monthly fair value gap, and then we just kind of bounced in between those two fair value gaps for most of the week. And then you can see eventually DXY continued lower, breaking the previous lows, coming deeper into the daily fair value gap. So my expectation is DXY will probably continue further to the downside now. We have our discount level just below, but the most logical area that I'll be watching is the sell side liquidity, and you can see on the daily time frame we have a fair value gap right below that as well. So a sweep of the liquidity and then coming into the daily fair value gap will likely show a reaction. And then at that point we just need to see the way price is moving to see if we have a potential reversal or potential redistribution to drive price lower to the downside. Now going to the 4-hour time frame, so what you can see is after that drive down we had a reaction, price pushed up, it came into the 4-hour fair value gap, and then further a little higher into the hourly fair value gap. So this hourly fair value gap within the 4-hour fair value gap actually held, but we were mostly bouncing in between the two PD arrays most of last week. But then we had that last sweep of liquidity on Friday, and thereafter price drove to the downside, broke the previous lows, and it looks like we're just going to get continuation now. It's not to say that we can't have a pullback, because you can see that we did create two areas of inefficiency on the way down. Whether the higher one price goes back to or not, I'm not so sure, but I'm thinking that it's probable or likely that we get a pullback into the lower fair value gap. And if we go on the hourly time frame, so just zooming in a little, what you can see is not only do we have that 4-hour fair value gap just above us, but we also have a breaker block, an hourly breaker block just above that, as well as an hourly supply as well. So it wouldn't surprise me if we did get that pullback, fill the fair value gap, tap into the breaker block and the supply before coming right back down and continuing further to the downside. And as I mentioned previously, if we do get that continuation to the downside, eventually I'd like to see the sell side liquidity down here get swept. Just not sure right now whether we'll see a reversal or not, mainly because the fundamentals are currently hinting at a weaker dollar, and we may just get continuation to the downside, maybe even going to the lower end of the weekly range. Okay, so moving on to EU, starting with the monthly time frame. So what you can see on this time frame, EU has gone up quite aggressively. It's gone right through that monthly fair value gap. It's also already come into premium levels, as well as tapping into the monthly order block. For now, all the momentum is to the upside, but if EU wants to continue bearish, then this would probably be the area that we would be watching for a reversal and continuation to the downside. On the weekly time frame, So you can see we had a pretty aggressive move to the upside last week. And if you saw my weekend analysis last weekend, I said that if we continued further to the upside, there weren't really any inefficiencies or any clear PD arrays further to the upside. And as you can see, we have this weekly breaker block, but that's it. We don't have any other further confluence. So for me, the most logical thing to happen is if we do see a reversal in this area, it's going to go for this buy side liquidity first. So a sweep of this buy side liquidity would be the first area that I would look for reactions and potential areas of reversal to push the price right back down. But at the same time, I mean, I've already talked about a lot about the fundamentals. I'm not so sure it's going to happen. We may just continue further to the upside from here and seek higher levels, potentially the buy side liquidity here that would bring us into OTE area. Now onto the daily time frame. So you can see that we started the week bullish, had a very aggressive move to the upside, swept through the daily fair value gap, and this daily fair value gap now acts as an inverse fair value gap. And you can see we just did a lot of reaccumulation, and ultimately this daily inverse fair value gap held. We had one last sweep of the lows before aggressively driving to the upside, breaking the previous highs. So for me, it looks like we are going to continue to the upside and target this buy side liquidity above. On this time frame, the main areas that I'll be watching come next week is reaction around Thursday's high. So I'm guessing we may get a pullback coming back around Thursday's high before we see any kind of continuation to the upside. And then the next area of interest will be the buy side liquidity above. But note that there is a small fair value gap just above this daily fair value gap. So it would make more sense if we did sweep the buy side liquidity to come into the daily fair value gap before we had a significant reaction and potential reversal. But if it pushes higher, then the next area I'll be watching is the buy side liquidity up here. That'll bring us into OT levels. Okay, now moving on to the 4-hour time frame. So what you can see is we have created a very nice 4-hour fair value gap just below the previous highs. So what often happens when you take out a previous high, you usually get a pullback. So pulling back below the previous high perfectly matches the 4-hour fair value gap that we have right below it. And then if we zoom in even further and have a look at what we see on the hourly time frame, so we have a lot more confluence on the hourly time frame. So first we have the fair value gap itself, and then you can see we have an hourly demand zone that coincides almost exactly where the 4-hour fair value gap is. The fair value gap is also within an hourly breaker block. And if you look at the fib levels from the last drive to the upside that broke the high, it's also within OT levels as well. So this 4-hour fair value gap makes a lot of sense. So coming back for a pullback into this fair value gap where we potentially see a shift, and then the next drive to the upside is what I would like to see, targeting the buy side liquidity above. Okay, and then if we zoom out again, so if price does continue further to the upside, like I said, the next logical area is this buy side liquidity. So price may continue and keep on going to the upside, but if you think about the higher time frame structure, this bullish move that we have should just be a pullback, and eventually we should reverse at logical levels. So buy side liquidity here or here, and then come right back down and create a lower low. But one thing that worries me a little is the fundamentals are showing that, or hinting that we should see a weaker dollar, and if the dollar continues to become weaker and weaker, then that means EU is just going to continue to push higher and higher to the upside. And if you remember the chart I presented a few weeks back, let me just bring it back up. So if we look back at this chart, I mean, if you consider the picture and what's happening now and what I was forecasting, it's playing out quite nicely. But if it does continue to push to the upside, then it may just continue and break the highs and continue further to the upside from there. Anyways, let's go back to the previous chart. So just to summarize, I am bullish on EU for the time being. I'd like to see continuation to the upside, but before doing so, I would like to see a pullback, and this fair value gap seems like the most logical area to see pullbacks to before potential reversal and continuation to the upside. In terms of upside targets, obviously the buy side liquidity and potentially the daily fair value gap above it seems like the most logical area to target next. But looking at the way the fundamentals are, we may just see further continuation to the upside. At this point, I don't want to forecast too far into the future. The only thing I'm thinking right now is this bullish move that we're seeing right now should just be a pullback in the overall weekly leg that we've made before we see a reversal and continuation to the downside, creating lower lows. That's what structure is showing me, and that's what makes the most sense. But at the same time, the fundamentals are giving a different picture. But whatever happens with the fundamentals and the structure that we're seeing right now, I mean, we still have potentially several weeks before a reversal plays out, if it plays out. Anyways, that's it for this weekend's analysis. Hopefully you guys found some value in today's video, and if you did, a like and a subscribe would be appreciated. Enjoy the rest of the weekend, and I'll see you for the next one. Peace.
Black Swan.